Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the IDRiM podcast. Today, what we're going to explore is a journal paper in the IDRiM journal called Post Earthquake Recovery in Suzu City, Evaluating Temporary Shelter Conditions, Policy Driven Inequalities, and 3D Printed Reconstructions for Rural Communities. So, we've invited the author on to talk about his research. So, hello.
Hello, it's an honor to be on the podcast, man. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So, would you like to introduce, yourself
Yeah.
for our listeners?
So my name is Takuzwa Chikwana. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I've been studying in Japan for the last 6 years. I'm an architect by profession, but my research has to do with disaster recovery in earthquake and floods and landslide prone regions across Africa as well as Asia.
So, wonderful to me, and we've met, I think, online a few times now.
Yeah.
So let's get into the questions. And so, when I was reading your paper, I actually had about
Hmm.
19 questions I could think of. So
Yeah.
let's get into this. So, what made you focus on Suzu City, specifically, rather than the
Mm.
recovery in the Noto Peninsula more broadly?
Mm.
Because we know that in Noto, there was devastation in lots of different areas. So why this specific city itself?
Mm. Um, So I chose Suzu because well, first of all, it's the most northern tip of the peninsula. And I wanted to focus on very remote places. I mean, the peninsula itself is like generally inaccessible, it's very remote, but the tip of the peninsula was very interesting to me because they experienced the earthquake, they experienced the tsunami, and the heavy rains that followed a few months after. So this was uh, an interesting place for me to choose.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, and and anyone who's watching this on the side here, you'll be able to see a image of the peninsula itself and where Suzu is located. So you framed the recovery, as an architectural and social process, not, simply about rebuilding, infrastructure. So most people would think that, when we need to recover, it's about rebuilding the infrastructure as quick as possible. And
Yeah.
when did you realize then it's that the built environment was shaping, different people's trajectory, where some people were recovering quicker and then some
Mhm.
people were not recovering as quickly?
That's a great question. But my original research wasn't in Suzu. I was doing my research in Chimanimani in Zimbabwe, which is it's the eastern region of Zimbabwe. It's also very remote. And when I was doing my field work here, I noticed um, the delays in shelter provision or recovery provision and how that affected different people at different stages. And for example, some residents will receive shelters uh, months before other people, and then these people will begin to recover way faster than the people who would get the shelters months down the line. So this kind of made me interested in how this kind of discrepancy, how it affects people. And then when I came to Suzu as well, I noticed similar trends. So that's what made me focus on this recovery trajectories and the how it's framed.
Just thinking about that, is there any reason why some people might get them quicker than others? Is there any like policy driven decision, or is it just pot luck that some people get it? They get their housing recovery
Yeah.
faster than others.
I think, yeah, it depends on the country and how the government handles it. In some places, everyone gets them on time, and then they just fill in their names. But in some places, it's more of a hierarchy system where most affected people get the shelters first. But then this is also sort of subjective in a way because everyone is affected. In other places, it's a raffle. Like for Chimani Mane example, you're not really guaranteed to get a shelter as soon as the disaster happens, right? So you have to wait, and you don't know when you're gonna get there. So it really depends on the policy and the local government. I noticed.
So in Suzu, is there any hierarchical system of policy that's driven, or is it generally is potluck?
In Suzu, particularly, they have this evaluation criteria of how they assess how damaged a place is. So once they see this, they can categorize how badly your house or property is damaged, and then they can allocate you first. But it's also sort of potluck because you don't know when or where you're gonna be, and this, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, really affects how people recover because you don't know like the timeline of things, right? So that's how it's been in Suzu.
Yeah, and we will obviously, based on the questions that we've talked about already, talk about this later. So you said, in your paper, you spent about 10 days in the field, speaking with the residents of Suzu. What
Yeah.
surprised you the most from, like your experience on the ground?
Um, I think for me, what surprised me the most is despite everything everyone's going through, a lot of people still are very kind and very sharing and very open and communicative about the things they're going through. Um, in Suzu, I first went there as a volunteer, and then when I was there, I got to interact with people up, besides my research, and this this experience kind of made me understand the people more. Because if you go as research, they're kind of apprehensive because they're like, why is this guy probing us? Why is he questioning us? But during my field work, particularly this resident who was affected, she was living in a temporary shelter. We were speaking, and at some point we're speaking about things other than my research questions, and she was asking me, do I do sports? Do I play sports? I said yes, I play basketball. And then this interaction led her to organizing a basketball thing where me and her children and the other local uh, kids could play together. And then she drove me like 50 minutes through the mountains to the nearest basketball court, and she had food and fruits and everything. So this kind of kindness is, I felt, is very common in places affected by disaster where people don't have, or people have lost a lot of things, but yet they still have so much to give. That's really what I was surprised by the most.
Yeah, it sounds like, like a real family, almost family
Yeah.
atmosphere, that builds and that I feel it almost like, and I've been to Japan a number of times myself, where if you look, you look out for them, they'll look out for you type happening,
Yeah.
and it generally, it always is quite heartening to see that type of, even from the media, I
Mhm.
could see that come through after the Noto earthquake. That there was the local people did seem to look after the, those who were
Yeah.
trying to help them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, definitely. It's a very, it becomes the it's already a tight knit community, but after they go through something like this, they're more, it gets, the bond gets stronger, I feel like.
yeah, absolutely. So in your paper, one of the things that came across as one of the strongest claims you made is that post disaster recovery can actually deepen inequality rather
Mhm.
than trying to reduce it. And we know that through the PAR model of 1998 that these inequalities caused the impacts of the disasters. So what would surprise some of our listeners is actually in Suzu,
Mhm.
based on your paper, that actually these inequalities get worse, after this
Mhm.
disaster. Can you explain
Mhm.
how that happens in practice?
Okay. So in my paper, I discuss how this inequality across different regions gets worse. But in Suzu in particular, the one of the main things is the policy induced discrepancies. For example, um, or just like socioeconomic discrepancies. For example, in Suzu, like the elderly, it's a very aging population. Um, and a lot of the case, a lot of the households are single income households or single person households where there's not that much um, continuous salary background. So getting the pension and then the insurance claims for the house becomes very difficult for a lot of the occupants. And then if you compare that to those who are several income households, they get much more lenient insurance claims and things of this nature. So at first, it might not seem so much, but over time, when the people with more access to these things, they start recovering faster, they start rebuilding faster. Over time, these gaps sort of kind of widen. And it's difficult to see if you don't do like a continuous research. If you just go one time, you won't notice it. But you need to, continuously ask these questions and continuously invest in the research to see how these things are going.
Yeah, so you mentioned, that Suzu, and we know that in Japan a lot of these more rural areas are very elderly, communities now.
Very much so.
And so so you said about, those about pensions and insurance. I'm just thinking about the insurance bit for a second. Is it for those who are like, single pension, are they finding it difficult, A, to get a claim, from their insurers, and then B, to be reinsured after this? Because they're not, I mean, if you're a single elderly person on a pension, you've not got a large amount of disposable income usually after the
Yeah.
event. And is this a threat then that they're getting priced out of the insurance market, and then how do you recover from that? Is the way I was thinking about this when you were talking there.
Yeah, that's the important part, because the insurance is not really a fair system when it comes to people over the age of 65, for example. In Japan, they don't want to have that risk. They would rather deal with someone who's 35. So it becomes much harder for them to claim anything once they reach a certain age. So this is one of the reasons why the elderly people in this community are struggling right now. They don't have the funding to rebuild the houses, so they stay in these shelters for an uncertain number of months or years. So this is a big problem now. Yeah.
And that's actually quite a surprise when you mention it, because you think of, Japan has, in proportional terms, has the most amount of elderly people anywhere in the world. You would naturally think that they would want, to help the elderly, because it's a very sizable proportion of the country. And
Yeah.
it sounds like that's not the case, in Japan.
Yeah, no, it's a very tricky situation. Yeah.
So in your paper, you use terms like, and that kind of links on here, policy induced, discrepancies and post disaster polarization. Were these patterns visible immediately after the earthquake? The first 24, 48 hours, you obviously might not have been on the ground. Or did they emerge over time? Is these the sort of things that just over time creep into the system?
Yeah, I think at first, an example I like to use to some of my younger colleagues or other students doing similar research is that at this before an earthquake or before a disaster, everyone starts at 100, and most people likely go down to zero or close to zero. And then if the policies and the systems are in place properly, everyone should go back to 100 within a certain period of years. But that's not always the case. And some people with better access to information, better access to resources, all these things, their rate of recovery is much faster than those who don't, or those who are much elderly, or those who are in disadvantaged positions. So it's not something very evident at the start, which is why I urge continuous research, because the gap sort of widens over the months, over the years. So it's not something you can immediately tell that this is going to happen, but it occurs over time.
Yeah, and I've noticed now throughout what you said about, the need to, have a continuous, investigation into these. And I feel that as researchers, sometimes we are guilty of, some of us are guilty of, doing what I call snapshot research, where you just take a given time I know that for my field of climate research, we are very guilty of snapshot research, and I imagine
Hmm.
it's the same in post earthquake recovery systems where and
Hmm.
tsunami systems where there are these snapshots, and
Hmm.
more because longitudinal takes a lot more time and a lot more money. We
Hmm.
I feel that sometimes the research community doesn't want to do that because there's very limited resources available nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely the case. And it gets worse when you're talking about remote regions where it's even harder to access and there's even more less resources and help. So it is very challenging, but I think it's very important to invest into that.
Yeah, and that's what one of the things about this podcast is, designed for, is to find the challenges and try and work out how
Yeah.
we can address these. Um,
Yeah.
Now, your paper pushes back against treating elderly, or older adults as a single vulnerable category. I've come across these types of, theories before, and I remember one of my professors who, used to advise me years ago when I was doing my master's, Maureen Fordham, where she said the same thing, but she said that females are not should not be classed as a homogenous,
Mm,
vulnerable category. And what are the differences you observe amongst these elderly survivors? Because I can imagine that some people, like Nori, I can imagine Nori Okada, in this category, Professor Nori Okada,
yeah.
who would know straight away what to do, how to recover, and then others
Mhm.
who may not be the same. So, can you tell us a bit more about the differences within this category?
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, they tend to categorize elderly people like above 60 as one group. Whereas within this group, there's like, especially in Suzu, there's a large population of people over 85. And, it's important to realize that first. And then following that, even within these elderly people groups, there's people with different levels of literacy, different levels of access, different levels of resources. Um, some people might not even be mobile at this point. So it's important to really address the most vulnerable groups, not just the elderly people, because even within this category, there's a lot of subcategories of people that have different needs, different ways to address their recovery process. So that's what I found really sort of not irritating, but it bothered me a lot because a lot of the residents they claim that they felt neglected. The elderly residents, they claim that all the paperwork and the procedures, they're not really addressing them as people. They're just addressing the group. So I think it needs to be more focused, more focused help per group, or like not per group per se, but more targeted procedures per the different types of help that's needed.
Yeah, and when you were talking about that, I was just thinking there as well as that is there a risk that help is provided but to the wrong people? If you are
Mm,
70, 75, you've
mm,
got no health problems, you can move around, you've got resources. How is it then? I hate the term fair, but in this case it
mm,
is. You get the same amount of attention, or even maybe even get it sooner than someone who's
mhm,
85, someone who has limited mobility and has no financial resources. I'm thinking if
mhm.
you are treating them as a homogenous category, well, then you are going to have people, you talk about trajectories.
Yeah.
That's not going to help these bring all the trajectories back very
No,
similarly.
no, it's not. No. But then I do understand from a policymaker's perspective that they can't allocate enough resources per individual. So there has to be a better way to address this.
Yeah, and it's almost like it sounds like it's a matrix system that is needed where
Mm-mm,
you categorize people on the levels of vulnerability and give them a score.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Maybe might be better, but then that gets more subjective and more.
Yeah. Yeah,
I can imagine policymakers would hate that idea.
they would. But then it's interesting. In some places in Japan, they do individual recovery planning. That's way before the disaster happens. So they go to these communities and they talk to each. They go to each household and they make a plan for that household. And in an event that this or that happens, this is what you're gonna do. And we've found that this kind of rigid planning before an event really kind of minimizes the the effects afterwards, and because everyone already has in their mind what's likely to happen. So this could be an option, but also this is a very tedious job, having to visit every house, having to make a plan for each and every person, because at the end of the day, this event will affect everyone, and you don't know how it's going to happen. You don't know when it's going to happen, what the situation is going to be. So you can't fully prepare for it, but it's a step in the right direction, I believe.
Mm. And I'm just thinking in the UK, we already have a similar system in place as well, because we do have a lot of more elderly, vulnerable communities. And I
Mm,
know that, okay, we don't get the same style of events, but I know that,
mhm,
the councils are legally bound to have records of who's vulnerable, what's their vulnerabilities.
mhm,
And actually, some of the households are already adjusted around those vulnerabilities in the event of,
mm.
say, flooding. So I know that
Yeah,
it can be done, but I know also from the other side, it's very time consuming, very
very much so.
money style consuming as well, which is may not be the ideal if you're a council, you've got a local government that's already struggling financially
Yeah,
to have.
yeah.
So
It's a
you
tough balancing act.
it is, and that's the whole point about about you're never gonna get it perfect. It's never gonna
No.
because no local government's gonna have a spare 20 million US dollars on this type of thing.
No.
It'd be great if we could, but
Yeah,
it's not gonna happen.
it's not how it is. No.
No. So, you talked as well in your paper about dignity as a part of
Hmm.
recovery. It's one of them things where dignity, for some reason, never seems to come up very often. And the only
Hmm.
time I can ever remember dignity as an observer ever really came up
Hmm.
was after Hurricane Katrina in 2005.
Hmm.
What does dignity look like in these post, disaster housing in Suzu City?
That's a very good question. It's also something that was not often talked about, but then I feel it's a very important part of recovery. Well, in my research in particular, I define dignity as sort of having the confidence in the system, having the confidence that your future will be brighter, having the confidence that you can have a roof over your head, and you know that your society will go back to the way it was. And this kind of the feeling of this confidence and having a good social support network and all these things combined, I feel is a sense of dignity. Well, in the context of how I describe it in my research. And then it's like once you have these things and you can maintain a certain level of normalcy, that's really the driving factor. If you can get back to normal, if you can get back to baseline, this is what's really gonna stop that diverging recovery trajectories, and having that dignity is important.
Yeah, and you said about you getting back to normalcy as well, is that in some cases, I know that after the Great Eastern Earthquake of 2011, about moving people from that normalcy as well, and I
Mhm,
know that it might be easier, to move
mhm,
people to where there is spare housing, where there is a place, to put a roof over their head, but you've hit the nail on the head. It's that normalcy, and it's
mhm.
that sense of place. You've grew up. A lot of these people have
Yeah,
grew up in these communities. They've lived in these
yeah,
communities all their life, and then after the Fukushima nuclear accident, they have to be moved out of these, and a lot of
mhm.
them never really recovered because they were taken out of their
No,
sense of place. And I
yeah,
think that's another thing that we don't. that I think I won't say policy, hasn't done this right, but don't
Mhm.
understand that people don't want to move even after the earthquake
Yeah,
or the disaster. They just want their life to go back to how it was.
yeah, 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 and that's the challenging part because a lot of governments. I mean, it really depends on the event that happens, right? Sometimes you can't go back to it, but a lot of the times it's easier to move people out and then kind of say, okay, that's fine, we're done. And then, but the people just, like you said, they just want to be where they grew up. They want to be where it's familiar, you know. So it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah, I just think I've lived all my life in the same house as well, and
Hmm.
I just feel that if I was taken away, it would even at 32, it would be difficult, and you know, f-
Yeah.
and I just feel that that's sometimes just overlooked, and it's something that I
Hmm.
feel that we need to be more mindful of. And I know there's
Yeah.
plenty of research outside of the disaster community on a sense of place, and I know that it is creeping in as well.
Hmm.
But I feel that from a policy perspective, it needs to be more thought of and recognized as a
Yeah.
issue.
Yeah. I think also, besides that, having that sense of place, a lot of people in these regions, they grew up or they most of their lives they've only done one line of work. For example, in Suzu, it's fishing or agriculture or like craft making. And then once they get moved, they can't do that. They don't know anything else. So this you can't really go back to normal if you can't work or you don't have that purpose anymore. So that's what I've noticed is really challenging in this region.
Yeah, and some people, even after what we would class as a normal retirement age, will continue working because it's
Absolutely.
it's all that they know. It gives them something to do as well because it's better than just sitting around all day watching television. Keeps the mind, the
Yeah.
body, going. Thank you for watching this episode of the IDRiM podcast. This is part one of a two-part recording. Next time, we're going to focus on the gendered experience, in particular of females and elderly females in Suzu City. We're also going to focus on the temporary shelters, in particular around their challenges that they provide, and also the more newer types of accommodation that may be coming down, which are more like 3D printed temporary accommodation. We hope to see you next episode.